My husband and I just recently got married, and I had just landed my dream job just a year out of college. My husband and I met at California State, and it was love at first sight. When I got the call to move to New York to work for a beauty company, he was more than happy to leave our old life behind and start a new chapter. We flew out to New York to look for a place outside of the city, but still close enough where the commute wouldn't be awful. After some searching, we finally found the perfect home. We put in an offer on the spot, and I was back within a week to move in. Our new home was nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, offering a perfect blend of small-town charm and big city convenience. The house itself was a beautiful 2-story with a large front porch, multiple bay windows, and a backyard that backed out into a small patch of woods. I started moving in without my husband as he needed to stay behind in California to finish his 2-week notice and work on selling our old house. The first night of unpacking went smoothly. The neighbors even stopped by and were friendly and welcoming, making me feel at ease. On the second day, I decided to explore the town. I wanted to freshen up first, so I hopped in the shower and got dressed. I remembered taking my unpacked box of makeup into the master bathroom, so I headed there to grab it. However, I couldn't find it anywhere. I swore I'd put it on the vanity, but it was nowhere to be found. I figured I must have been mistaken and decided it was a good reason to go buy some new makeup anyway. When I got back home, it was just starting to get dark. I wasn't quite used to the time change yet, and it felt way earlier than what it actually was. I brought my bag straight to the bedroom. I grabbed the makeup I had just bought and went to put it away in the bathroom. When I walked through the bathroom door, I almost tripped over a box, dropping half my makeup in the progress. I went down to move the box and realized it was my missing box of makeup. Confused, I wondered how I could have missed it earlier. It was literally laying in the middle of the floor. Before I even really had time to process this, I heard a noise downstairs. My immediate thought was that my husband had surprised me with an early visit. While I did think this was strange, it was my first thought at the time. I called out his name, but he didn't answer back. I went downstairs, still calling his name, but nothing. I checked the doors and they were still locked. Not finding this funny anymore, I called my husband. He finally picked up, and I told him he should have told me he was able to come home early. And that's when he told me he was still sitting in his office in California, and my heart suddenly dropped. I told him about the missing, then reappearing box of makeup and about the noises I had just heard. He told me not to panic and that I probably just overlooked the box of makeup and that I was not used to the sounds of the new house yet. While I wasn't entirely convinced it was just my imagination, I told him he was probably right. We chatted for a little bit longer, then I got off as I was going to bed. I checked the house one more time and made sure that everything was locked. Once satisfied, I went upstairs and got into bed. I can't remember what time it was, but I just remember waking up to some weird sounds in my bedroom. Still groggy, I slowly sat up and turned on the lamp next to my bed. What I saw seriously still gives me chills to this day. I saw a filthy man at the foot of my bed. He reeked like garbage and his hair was all matted and disgusting. My scream echoed through the house as I jumped out of bed. I put as much distance as I could between him and I, backing myself into a wall. Still screaming at him, I finally asked him what he was doing in my house. He then smiled this eerily creepy smile and said that he thought the house looked nice and that he wanted to stay for a while. I literally had no response for him, as I honestly had no idea what to even say. However, before I could say anything at all, he then pointed to the bathroom. He said he had found my box of makeup and took it to the bathroom for me. He said that I should be thankful to have such a nice roommate. I was absolutely disgusted and terrified. It felt like the whole world had just stopped moving. He then stepped around to the side of the bed towards me, still smiling. In a surge of adrenaline, I pushed him on the bed and tried to run past him. He fell onto the bed but grabbed my arm in the process. I hit him as hard as I could with my other hand, and it was just enough for him to let go and for me to rip my arm out of his hand and run away. I ran straight to the neighbor's house and pounded on their door. They came out pretty quickly and let me inside. I tried to explain to them what had just happened, but I was so shaken up, I'm not even sure they understood what I was saying at first. They called the police and they were there within minutes. By this point I had calmed down enough to be able to tell the police exactly what had happened. The police searched the entire house and the man was nowhere to be found. However, after searching the attic, they did discover a makeshift living space there. It was clear he had been there for some time, likely even there when we first viewed the house. That night taught me a valuable lesson. Always trust your instincts and thoroughly check every nook and cranny before making a new house your new home. Growing up, my parents made a living by buying old houses, remodeling them, and turning them into rental properties. By the time I was 20, they had dozens of these properties and were quite well off. I spent most of my free time with them, helping with remodels, and I loved every second of it. I learned how to do almost everything myself, from plumbing to carpentry. While I loved helping my parents with their properties, I wanted to branch out on my own and start doing my own house remodels. With some savings and a little help from my parents, I had finally enough to put a down payment on my first project, an old 3-story house from the early 1900s. The house was beautiful despite its age, at least in my eyes. It was located in the middle of a small town, so it had that rural vibe, but was close enough to all the necessities such as food and gas, the perfect place for a rental. The price was almost too good to be true, but the catch was I couldn't do an inspection beforehand and the sale was final. Confident in my abilities to fix anything, I signed the papers and got the keys. The first thing I did was walk through the house, envisioning the work to be done. The floors needed replaced, plumbing fixed, walls painted, and so on. Despite its worn condition, I could see the potential in every room. I decided to start with the kitchen and living room. For 2 weeks, I commuted from my parents' house that was about an hour away. It was exhausting, but the progress was rewarding. It was slowly coming together. I knew I'd make faster progress if I didn't spend the extra time going back and forth from my parents' house to the new property, so I decided to just move in. I moved a basic bedroom set and supplies into one of the smaller bedrooms, planning to work on the master bedroom next. The room I chose was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single small window. I figured once I finished the master bedroom, I could just move into that. That first night, exhausted from working, I collapsed into bed and fell asleep. A few hours later, I suddenly woke up, but was unsure why. Groggy, I grabbed my phone to use its flashlight and scan the room. To my horror, in the corner stood a girl with pale skin and sunken eyes, staring right at me. Paralyzed with fear, I could barely move, let alone scream. Still looking at me, she said the words, "Help me, he won't let me out." I was finally able to yell. I dropped my phone and scrambled for the light switch. When I flipped it on, she was gone, as if nothing was ever there. My heart was racing. Did I just have a nightmare? I spent the rest of the night in my truck, too scared to go back inside. The next morning, I searched the house but found no one. Embarrassed and convinced it had all been a dream, I threw myself back into work. But that night, the thought of the girl and her coming back haunted me, even if it was just a dream. Too scared to sleep in the bedroom, I dozed off on the couch in the living room. I had finished remodeling this area, so it felt safer and more familiar. Once again, seemingly for no reason, I woke up. The TV was still on, casting a light across the room. The TV light lit the room up just enough for me to tell that I was alone, no creepy girl. Feeling relieved, I went to the kitchen to get a drink of water before going back to bed. I walked into the kitchen and fumbled for the light switch. When I found it, I flipped it on. When the light came on, there she was, the same girl from last night, standing in the kitchen. I screamed, both in fright and in anger. I yelled at her asking who she was and why she was in my house. She looked at me completely emotionless. There was a brief moment when I stopped yelling. She slowly raised her hand and pointed at the door. The door that she was pointing at was the door that led to the basement. I had been down there a couple times, but it was probably the area in the house I had been in the least. Still pointing at the door, she said just above a whisper, "He won't let me out." Before I could react, the kitchen light bulb exploded with a loud pop and an unearthly scream echoed from the basement. Terrified, I ran from the kitchen, falling over everything in my mad scramble to get out of that house as quickly as I could. I ran to my truck, locked myself in, and called my dad. I was so shaken I could barely explain to him what had just happened. He told me that he was on his way. About an hour later, my dad finally arrived. Together we went back into the house. My dad checked around the living room and saw nothing. It was just as I left it. We then went to the kitchen. The light wouldn't turn on, confirming to my dad that that part of the story actually happened. He then walked over to the basement door, opened it, and he slowly descended the stairs. The basement wasn't really that big. It was maybe 30 by 30 feet, and the room was pretty open. We looked around the entire room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. We were just about to leave when we heard a slight knocking sound that came from one of the corners of the room. We walked closer and saw a tool bench. My dad glanced around, trying to see if he could find the source of the sound. He peered behind the bench and then shouted at me. I walked closer and he said there was something behind the bench. Together, we pulled the bench away from the wall, revealing a very small, crawl space-looking door. After getting the door fully revealed, I immediately noticed something was off. This door was metal, and it had a large, heavy-duty lock on it. My dad then said we should cut the lock open and see what was inside. I started to protest as he was looking around for something to cut it open with. However, we both stopped and heard 3 quiet but very distinct knocks coming from behind the door. We both looked at each other in horror. We bolted upstairs and immediately called the police. The police were quick to arrive, however they didn't hear any of the knocking sounds. They also couldn't get the lock open either. They eventually had to bring in the fire department to get the door open. While I didn't actually get to see what was inside, they did find the skeletal remains of a woman. They were not sure how long she had been dead, but guessed at least 15 years. The police never figured out who she was or who killed her, at least to my knowledge. I never saw that ghostly figure again. I did finish the remodel, but I never stayed the night, and my dad paid a lot of money for the work to be contracted out so I didn't have to do it alone. The house sat empty for 2 years before someone finally bought it. In the end, I lost a lot of money on that house. I hope that poor girl's soul can finally move on after we found her body. I hope I never have any sort of experience like this ever again. I grew up in the city of Detroit. While we definitely didn't live in the worst parts of the city, we still had to lock our doors, be home by dark, and keep one eye open at all times. As I am sure you can guess, my family never had a lot of money, and we all had to pitch in to make ends meet. I was the only one in my family who made it to college. I was able to get my degree in cybersecurity and landed a really good work-from-home job. It was good enough that I was finally able to be in a position financially where I could escape the rough city life. I had always dreamed of moving to a country area with land and lots of trees. I wanted to know what it was like to go into a backyard and not see anyone. I started looking in some of the more rural areas outside of Detroit as I didn't want to be too far from my family. About an hour outside of Detroit, I found a great home for sale. It was nestled among dense trees, a big backyard, and a great spot for a garden. It was a 2-story home, which was more than enough for me and any future family I may have. It was perfect. No neighbors in sight. Well, for the most part. There was one house that you could see from the back side of the house. It was just outside of the tree line, but it could really only be seen from the master bedroom window. It was good enough for me, and the best part is that it was within my price range. I moved in almost right away. A week went by, and I was settling in nicely. Everything was going great. Occasionally I would peer out the bedroom window at the neighbor's house, but never saw any signs of life. No movement, no lights, nothing. Then, one night as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed a light on in the house. Part of me was hoping no one lived there, but then again I thought maybe it would be nice to have neighbors. I shut the blind and went to bed. A few days later, I once again looked out the window and saw a strange flickering light, like a fireplace. It seemed odd, but I shrugged it off and closed the blind and went to bed. A few hours later, I woke up and went to grab the water on the nightstand. As I was taking a drink, I thought I heard a low, mumbling sound. I glanced around the room and noticed there was an orange flickering light, just slightly coming through the blinds from the outside. I got up, lifted the blinds to see what the light was. When I opened the blinds, I was shocked at what I saw. There was a massive bonfire in the neighbor's yard. There were at least 10 people standing around it in a circle, and appeared to be wearing black robes and red masks. It was hard to tell for sure. However, now that I was looking at this group of people and the bonfire, I could tell this chanting sound I was hearing was coming from them. While I knew the sound was coming from them, it was still really hard to hear what they were saying. I stupidly tried to open the window to hear better, but it made this obnoxious loud creaking sound as I opened it. I froze. Suddenly, one of the figures looked directly at me and pointed. The chanting stopped, and every masked face turned towards me. They just stared at me for what seemed like a lifetime, and I was frozen. One of them said something I couldn't hear, then they all started running directly towards my house. I slammed the window shut, grabbed my cell phone, and locked myself in the bathroom. Panicking, I called the police, explaining the situation to the dispatcher, who told me to stay locked in the bathroom until police arrived. She was trying to keep me calm while asking more questions. I then heard a loud crash from downstairs. I didn't know exactly what made the sound, but I knew those people had just broken in. I started pleading with the dispatcher, asking her to help me. She urged me to stay quiet. I did as she asked, but it was nearly impossible for me to stay calm. A few minutes later, I heard several footsteps running up the stairs and then into my bedroom. I whispered to the dispatcher that they were in my room. She told me the police were almost there and to just stay hidden. That is when I heard them trying to open the bathroom door. When they found that it was locked, they started kicking it, trying to break it down. I screamed that the police were coming and they would be here any minute. The kicking stopped. I could hear whispering from outside the door, but couldn't figure out what they were saying. I then heard the footsteps walk away from the door and then down the stairs. About 10 minutes later, I heard the reassuring shouts of the police. I ran downstairs, practically falling into the arms of the officers. One of the officers stayed with me by his car and took my statement, while 2 other officers checked my house and a few others went to the neighbor's house. When they returned, they told me they had found the remains of the fire in the backyard, but no one else was there. They suggested I stay with friends or family for the night, and they would be in touch. I went back to my family's house in Detroit and planned on staying there for a few days. 2 days later, I got a call from a police officer. I found out that the owners of the house only stayed there a few times a year and weren't even in town at the time. They also confirmed that no one should have been in that house. The officer said the only evidence that they found that anyone was even there was the remains of that bonfire. I never heard anything else from the police if they had figured out who it was at my house or what they were doing there. It was the most terrifying experience I've ever been through. I wanted to sell the house, but my 2 brothers convinced me not to, and one of them ended up moving in with me. Even though I do feel safer with my brother, I'm still scared that maybe one day they'll come back and finish what I interrupted.